The auctioneer's gavel came down on a number so small, the men in the back row laughed out loud, a hard barking laugh that bounced off the courthouse rafters. And a woman of 26 named Della Vane raised her hand for 50 acres. Nobody in Heartfelt County had wanted to own in 20 years. She paid $311 for the back taxes owed on it, counting the money out in worn bills and coins onto the clerk's desk while the room watched, and she signed her name on the ledger, with a hand that did not shake, though she felt the shaking somewhere deep beneath the skin. Then she walked out into the March cold, her breath white before her, while a farmer named Osgood Pruitt said to no one in particular that she'd have done better to burn the money for warmth, and a few men chuckled their agreement, and the door swung shut behind her on the whole warm room of them. The land she'd just bought was a green wall of thorn. Multiflora rose had swallowed it whole, hedge upon hedge of it. 60 years, grown and taller than a man on horseback, so dense a rabbit couldn't cross it, and so mean it drew blood through a coat sleeve. There was said to be a creek in there somewhere, and a bridge, and a spring, but nobody living had seen them, and nobody wanted to. Folks called it the old Ketchum place, and they said it the way you'd name a grave. And that is where this story begins. Though to understand why a woman with almost nothing in the world would spend all of it on a briar patch, you have to go back some months earlier, to a smaller loss and a piece of advice from an old man who read land the way other people read faces. 3 winters before that auction, Della had come to Heartfelt County with a father who died that same second winter and left her a rented house she couldn't keep, a debt she hadn't made, and a reputation as the girl whose people were from away. He had been a printer by trade and a dreamer by nature, and he had brought her west-chasing work that thinned to nothing, and then a cough took him in February and the ground was too frozen to bury him proper until the thaw. She was too young, the town agreed, too poor, and the wrong sort of stubborn for a place that measured a person by how many generations of them lay in its churchyard. In Heartfelt County, a person's worth was a thing you inherited, and Della had inherited only debt and a strange last name. She took work where she could find it, sweeping and weighing, feed at the feed store for $1.50 a week, and boarding 2 nanny goats for a widow named Mrs. Sump who had grown too crippled to keep them. And it was the goats, in the end, that taught her the thing nobody else in that valley had bothered to learn. They would not touch good hay if there was thorn to be had. She watched them, evenings, strip a bank of Multiflora down to bare gray cane in a single week, standing high on their hind legs, working the leaves and the tender green tips and even the woody stems, with a patient, greedy joy, thriving on the very plant that farmers cursed and burned and poisoned and hacked at and never once beat. Her father had left her almost nothing that a bank would count, but he had left her the habit of watching what other people ignored, of standing quiet at the edge of a thing, until it gave up its secret. And she watched those 2 goats until she understood what the whole county had missed. The thorn that made the land worthless was not a curse at all. It was 50 acres of free food standing in the sun, waiting. The old man's name was Emil Ostrander, and he had come over from the old country as a boy of 9 and farmed the ridge above town for 50 years before his knees gave out under him. He kept a few goats still, out of what he called sentiment, and it was over his weathered fence that Della first spoke to him, that same winter, some months before the auction, when she came walking up the ridge road to ask whether a goat could truly live on brush alone through a hard season, or whether it was only a summer trick. Emil looked at her a long moment with pale eyes gone watery at the rims, taking in her mended coat and her chapped hands and the stubborn set of her jaw, and then he said a thing she would carry with her the rest of her life. Land does not know it is poor, he told her, in his slow, careful English, with its old country weight on the wrong syllables. Land only knows what you ask of it. Ask it for corn, where it wants to give thorn, and it will shame you every year until you die cursing it. Ask it for the thing it already wants to grow, and it will make you rich and never once charge you rent. He told her that the men down in the valley had been arguing with that particular hillside for 60 years and losing every argument, and that a wise person did not argue with land any more than they'd argue with weather. A wise person listened to it and gave it its head the way you gave a good horse its head on a bad road. Then he told her, watching her closely, about the 50 acres coming up for taxes. Come spring, the old Ketchum place, choked to death and abandoned and hated, and he watched her face the whole time he said it, and when he finished he smiled a little, privately, at what he had seen move behind her eyes. She did the arithmetic in the dark that spring, lying awake in the cold rented room she had 1 month left in, the way she would come to do it 100 nights after. She had the $311 saved for the taxes, scraped together penny over penny for 2 years, and $40 besides, and she had 2 goats. 2 goats could not clear 50 acres in a lifetime. She knew that plain. But 2 goats could become 4 in a single season, and 4 could become a dozen, and Multiflora Rose gave a nanny everything she needed to milk well and breed strong, and a healthy doe could throw twins, and in a good year, triplets. She counted it out on her fingers under the blanket. 8 the first year, if she was careful and lucky both. 16 the second. Better than 300 by the third, and after that a number she could scarcely hold in her head. And every one of those animals would be eating the very thing that had made the land free, turning worthless thorn into meat and milk and manure, and at the far end of all that counting, into cleared and open ground worth 20 times what she paid for it. It was mad arithmetic, and she knew it was mad. It depended on nothing going wrong across 3 whole years, and she had lived long enough to know that everything goes wrong across 3 years, that sickness and weather and men would all take their turn at her. But she had learned another thing in her short, hard life, which was that despair was only arithmetic done in a hurry, panic, dressed up as truth, and she refused to do it in a hurry. She did it slow, over and over in the dark, and done slow, the numbers held. And so in March, she raised her hand in that laughing room, and the land was hers. She moved onto the land in April with a canvas wall tent, a dented wood stove she'd salvaged off a burn pile behind the sawmill, her 2 does already bred, and a borrowed mattock with a loose head she wedged tight each morning. There was no house. There was barely a way in at all. She spent the first 3 days on her knees, cutting a path just wide enough to lead the goats through the outer hedge, and came out of the thorn each evening with her forearms laced in red welts that scabbed over in the night and tore open again the next day, until the skin of her hands went rough and cracked as bark, and she could no longer feel the small cuts, only the deep ones. The town heard of it within the week, the way a small town hears everything, and made of it a modest entertainment for a lean spring. Osgood Pruitt drove his wagon slow past the gap in the thorn on his way to the mill, just to see whether the crazy girl was still at it, and reported back at the feed store that she was, down on her knees in the brush like an animal, and that the old Ketchum place would kill her or beggar her before the leaves turned in the fall, one or the other. He'd stake money on it. The men at the feed store agreed, nodding into their coffee, that a young woman alone could no more tame that hillside than she could drain the sea with a spoon. They said it the way people say cruel things in a small place, dressed up as concern, shaking their heads slow and sorrowful, already tasting the sweet day they'd be proven right, and could say so. But Della had never once meant to tame it with her own 2 hands, and that was the whole of what they'd missed, standing there, guessing at her failure. She turned the goats loose inside a movable pen of woven wire. She shifted a few yards every second day, staking it fresh into whatever ground the animals had bared, and the goats did what goats have always done. They ate. They stood on their hind legs and pulled down cane taller than themselves, and stripped the leaves, and gnawed the bark clean around in a ring until the whole plant sickened at the root, and where they had passed the green wall, went gray and brittle, and come the dry of summer, snapped off at the ground under her mattock like so much dead kindling. In 1 week, 2 goats cleared a patch the size of a cabin floor. She banked that first small victory in her chest like a coal under ash. And she told no one. She had learned that a secret kept is a secret that cannot be laughed at, and that the surest way to rob a mockery of its power is to give it nothing to bite on. Let them think she was failing. Let Osgood Pruitt drive his wagon slow. The goats did not care what the town thought of them. And neither, she decided one long evening, watching them work in the falling light, would she Ada. She would keep her coal banked, and she would wait. And she would let the ground do the answering when it was ready. By June, the 2 does had kidded. one with twins and one with a single strong buckling that stood and nursed within the hour. And Della had 5 goats where she'd had 2, and a cleared quarter-acre where there had been only thorn, and a routine as fixed and turning as the earth itself. She rose before light and milked. In the gray cold, her forehead pressed to a warm flank, and she moved the pen, and she cut and dragged the dead cane into long windrows to dry, and by August, she was burning those windrows in careful evening fires that lit the ridge orange against the dark, and gave the men in the valley one more thing to point at and talk over. She learned the land as she uncovered it, foot by foot, the way you learn a beloved face by candlelight, slow and by touch. Under the thorn, she found the ghost of an old orchard, 4 apple trees strangled near to death, but not quite dead, their trunks scarred and their crowns choked, and she freed them one long afternoon with tears standing in her eyes that she could not have explained to anyone, cutting away the cane that had been slowly killing them for 30 years. She found a dry-laid stone wall, straight and true and beautiful, that some forgotten farmer had raised, with his own hands before the war, and fitted so well it had never fallen. She found the spring Emil had spoken of, boxed in mossy-dressed stone, running clear and cold as it had run since before any white man saw the valley, and she knelt on the wet stone and drank from it with her cupped hands, and thought, kneeling there, that a thing did not stop being good just because the whole world had agreed to forget it was there. Emil came up the new path in July, walking slow and pained on his ruined knees, with a whittled stick for a cane, and he stood at the edge of the cleared ground a long while, looking at the 5 goats and the neat windrows of dead cane, and the 4 freed apple trees reaching up thin and grateful into the light, and he was quiet the whole time. Then he told her what he had not told her before, because, he said, a person will only truly hear a hard thing when they are already ready to work for it, and telling them sooner is only noise. The Multiflora, he said, did not have to be only feed for goats. It had a fruit, a small red hip, that came on thick along the canes in the fall, and there were people in the cities who paid good money for the making of it, a syrup, a tonic, a preserve, a thing full of what the body craved after a long winter. His own mother had gathered it by the apronful in the old country and hung it drying by the stove. He told her she should not burn every hedge as fast as the goats could kill it, the way she'd been doing. She should let some stand along the good sunny slopes and gather the hips, come the fall, and dry them slow, and he knew a man for the buying of them, a grocer down in the county seat named Beaumont, who dealt with the city trade and might take all she could bring. Then he did a thing worth more than all the advice. He gave her 3 of his own does, the last 3 he meant to keep, leading them up the path himself, and he said that an old man had no use for a herd he could no longer chase, and a young woman had no use for an old man's sentiment, and so the 2 of them were square, and she was not to argue it. So she had 8 goats going into her first winter on the land, and she gathered the rose hips in the biting cold by the bucketful, her hands split and bleeding fresh, and dried them careful on screens propped near the stove in the wall tent, turning them so they would not mold. And in December, she loaded a full sack of them into a borrowed wagon and drove the long cold miles down to the county seat, and she sat waiting in the back of the grocer's storeroom, while a narrow, careful man named Cyril Beaumont looked her over the way. The whole county looked her over with a doubt that had already decided. Then he took one of the dried hips and put it in his mouth, and he held it there, thoughtful, and Della watched his face change exactly the way Emil had promised. It would, the skepticism going soft at the edges into surprise, and then narrowing again into something colder and keener, which was calculation. He asked her, mild as milk, how much she had. She had 40 pounds dried and screened. He weighed it out slow on his polished brass scale, sliding the little weights along the beam, and when he'd done the sum, he counted out into her hand more money for that one sack than she had paid for the whole 50 acres of land. Then he asked, careful and casual, studying his own scale and not her face, how much more she might bring him. Come the spring, she said, as much as he cared to buy. Driving the empty wagon home in the dark, with the money folded flat and warm against her ribs, she did the arithmetic once more, and for the first time in her life it came out, not as bare survival, but as something else, something larger, something she was almost afraid to say, even inside her own head. Word of that sack of dried hips and the money it fetched reached Hartselle County before Della's wagon did, the way word does travel in a small place, running ahead down every fence line, and the tenor of the talk about the crazy girl on the Ketchum place began, very slowly, to shift. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to have mocked it. And so, at first, the men at the feed store said she'd only been lucky, or that she'd somehow cheated the grocer, or that a fluke like that could never last a second year. But the second spring came, and the 8 goats kidded and became 16, and the 16 ate the thorn down to bare brown earth, across 3 whole acres, and Della hired on help, a thin, quiet boy of 12, named Toby, Mrs. Briqual's, Sump's grandson, whose folks in the hollow had too many mouths at the table and not near enough work for hands. The boy took to the place the way she herself had taken to it, watching everything, learning quick, giving every single goat a name, and never once forgetting one, and something in Della that had been shut and locked a long time opened a narrow crack to make a little room for him. By that second autumn she carried 300 pounds of dried hips down to Cyril Beaumont, and she had cleared and fenced enough open pasture that she and Toby raised a proper one-room cabin against the old stone wall, using that dead farmer's wall for one whole side of it so that hands from before the war held up her roof against the weather. It was in the 3rd year that the goats finally reached the creek down in the bottom ground, and what they uncovered there changed the whole shape of things, though not in any way Della could have guessed. All that summer she had been working the herd down the long slope toward the low ground, and the thorn down there was the oldest and the worst of all of it, a solid green mass, 40 feet through that no living soul had seen behind in memory. The goats ate into it a yard at a time, patient as always. And one bright morning in August, following the sound of running water she had heard for weeks and never once been able to reach, Toby came pelting back up the slope shouting her name, his voice cracking with it, and she dropped her mattock and followed him down through the fresh green tunnel the goats had eaten, ducking under the low canes. And there it was, a bridge. An old stone bridge, 3 arches of dressed gray stone spanning the creek, so old and so finely made that it did not look built so much as grown up out of the ground, moss-packed dark in its joints, and a young ash tree rooted, brave in a crack of the parapet, and beneath its arches the clear creek ran cold and talking over its stones. It had been there the whole time, all 60 years, under all that thorn, a thing of real and patient beauty that the entire county had driven around and forgotten and never missed. Della stood on it a long while with her rough hand flat on the cool stone and did not say a single word, and the boy, who had come to understand her by then, stood beside her and did not make her. That bridge, it turned out, was a great deal more than only beautiful, and here is where the story turns. Because the wider world had not forgotten it half so completely as Hartselle County had. The old road it carried had once been the county road itself, the main way through, before the new road was cut along the ridge 2 generations back and the old way left to the thorn. And the bridge, being old and finely made, sat on the historical rolls of the state, listed there in a ledger in the capital, though no living person in the county had thought of it in decades. And the thing about a structure on the state's protected rolls is that the state must, by its own written law, keep a public way open to reach it, for it belongs, in a sense, to everyone. So when the county surveyor came up at Della's own request that fall to mark her cleared bottom ground for the new line of fence, he found the bridge under her cliff of cut thorn, and he grew very quiet studying it, and then he pulled his hat off and told her plainly what it was she had. She had, all unknowing, bought herself a right-of-way. The old road across her land was a public road still, in the cold eye of the law, never once formally closed by any board. And the bridge was a protected structure the state was bound to maintain and keep reachable. What all of that meant for a woman running a herd of goats was very small and quiet. But what it meant for certain other men when they came to hear of it was not small at all. Those other men arrived in time, in the person of one Wendell Trace, who came up the path one clear October afternoon, in a fine gray coat with a leather case tucked under his arm, and a smile so broad and so warm It made the fine hairs on the back of Della's neck stand up. He was a land agent, he said, sweeping off his hat, representing certain interested parties, and he had heard the most remarkable things about all she had done with the old Ketchum place. Simply remarkable. A young woman entirely alone accomplishing so very much against such odds. Why, it was nothing short of an inspiration to hear of. He turned that smile up like the wick of a lamp. And because she had done so remarkably well, and because a person in her particular position surely felt the great weight of it, the loneliness, the risk of it all resting on one pair of hands, he was prepared, out of pure regard, to make her an offer that would set her up comfortable for life, somewhere gentler and easier. Then he named a figure. It was more money than Della had ever imagined, touching in one place, and she felt the raw pull of it in her tired, aching body, like a tide dragging at her ankles. He said it again, warmer still, leaning in, that someone alone could never really hold a place like this over the long haul. Not against a truly hard year. Not against her age and her sex and her circumstance, and that she owed it to herself to be sensible now, while sense could still profit her. And Della, who had spent 3 years learning to meet cruelty with perfect stillness, found she could meet this warm kindness the very same way, and she asked him only the one thing that mattered, which was why his interested parties should want 50 acres of cleared goat pasture quite so badly as all that. He should not have answered as smoothly as he did. A more careful man would have caught himself, but he was so sure of her, so certain she was too simple and too grateful to matter, that he waved a hand and told her the truth. The land itself was of little consequence, of course, he said. It was the access that they wanted, the historic bridge and the old lawful road, a small matter of connecting some scattered parcels up on the ridge for a development, building lots, nothing that need trouble her pretty head. And there it was, laid open, the one slip that told her everything at once. His interested parties had quietly bought up the ridge land above hers for a song, meaning to sell it dear as lots for summer houses. And the one and only lawful way to bring a road up to it, the single right-of-way the state would ever recognize, ran clean across her bottom ground and over her own old stone bridge. Without her land, those ridge parcels were worth a bare fraction of what was paid. With her land, they were worth a fortune. He had come up her path meaning to buy for a few $100s a thing worth, to them tens of thousands, and he had counted, coldly and completely, on a poor young woman all alone, being far too grateful and far too frightened to ever know the difference. Della thanked him for his trouble and told him evenly that the land was not for sale at any figure. His broad smile did not falter, not by a hair, but something behind it went hard and flat, and as he turned to go down the path, he said, in the pleasant even voice careful men use for their threats, that circumstances had a way of changing on a person, and that someone all alone up here ought to think good and hard about what a truly hard winter might do to a herd, and to a girl. That was October. What Della did not yet know, and what Wendell Trace and his party surely did not know either, was that Hartselle County was about to be tested in a way it had not been tested in 40 years, and that the testing would sort every living soul in it down to what they truly were beneath their talk. The winter that came grinding down out of the north that year was the hardest anyone could bring to mind. Snow to the eaves, and cold that split fence posts. And behind that winter, in the spring, came a drought, so complete and so cruel, that by June, the valley farms had cracked open across their fields like old dropped crockery. The corn came up hopeful and green and then curled at the edges and yellowed and died standing. The wells that had watered 3 whole generations of a family went dry and coughed up sand and then nothing. The creeks, the entire valley leaned on, shrank to threads, and then to strings of stagnant warming pools, and then to nothing at all but bleached white stones. And the fat green farms of the very men who had laughed longest at Della turned to dust that rose behind their wagon wheels like smoke off a fire. Hunger changes a town, and changes it fast. By August, there were families in Hartselle County who had not laughed in months, and lean children with old eyes, and proud men who could not meet one another's gaze across the empty feed store, and among those men was Osgood Pruitt, who had lost his corn and half his cattle already, and had a wife and 4 children under his roof, and no way at all through to spring that any arithmetic he could work would find him. But a drought is a thing that reads land, the very same as old Emil read it, and it read Della's 50 acres altogether differently than it read the rest of the valley. Multiflora rose does not curl up and die in a dry year. Its roots drive down deep, down where the shallow corn roots cannot follow, and it holds its bitter green leaves through a killing heat that withers everything soft and cultivated. And so Della's herd, 300 head strong now and grown fat and glossy across their ribs where the valley cattle stood staring and starving. The 8 of that first winter, multiplied year on year, went right on eating the way they always had. And the boxed spring that Emil had told her of, that first winter, the old cold spring, under the dressed stone at the top of her land, fed by water that had fallen as snow high on the ridge, in years no man now living could name, ran clear and steady on when every dug well in the valley below had failed. Because a spring like that one does not know or care that it is a dry year. It knows only the mountain that feeds it. So it came to pass that in the worst summer, within memory, the single piece of ground the whole county had for 20 years called worthless became the only ground for miles in any direction that had both cold water and green feed together. And the crazy girl on the old Ketchum place had, by nothing but patience and a willingness to listen, made herself without any fuss the richest person in all of Hartselle County, and hardly anyone had noticed it happen. And now comes the part of this story, most worth the telling, and the reason it is told at all, because a person's true worth is never shown in how they carry themselves when they have nothing, but rather in how they carry themselves when they suddenly hold everything, and the ones who once scorned them hold nothing at all. Della could have sold that spring water by the barrel at whatever ruinous price a dying town would scrape together to pay. Wendell Trace, when word reached him of how things now stood on the ridge, came back up her path quick with a fresh offer, higher than the last, and a low, smiling suggestion that she'd be a plain fool not to squeeze the whole valley for every last cent it had while she alone held the whip hand over its life. She could have done exactly that, and Osgood Pruitt, the very man who had laughed the loudest and driven his wagon slow past her gate to savor her coming failure, he came up her path too, that August, though it near killed his pride to set foot on it, and he stood before her cabin, twisting his good hat around and around in his cracked hands and could not for the life of him get the words out. And Della saw before her a proud and frightened man come to ask a girl he had badly wronged for the water to keep his children breathing. She thought about the men at the feed store and their slow, sorrowful heads. She thought about being called the wrong sort, from a way not fit. And then she thought about old Emil, who had led 3 does up her path, and called them square, and asked nothing, and she knew in that moment exactly what she was going to do, and it was not one thing that Wendell Trace, with all his figuring, had ever thought to expect. She called the whole of the county up to her land. She sent Toby down the ridge road on the fastest goat cart, with word to the church and the feed store, and every farm still clinging on, that anyone who needed water for their stock could come up and draw it from the old cold spring, all they could carry away, and it would cost them not 1 penny, and that there was brush enough standing on 50 acres to feed every starving cow in the whole valley besides. If only they would pen them fair and mind them. They came slow at first, ashamed to come at all, hats in their hands. And then they came in a long, steady stream of wagons and led animals up the very path they had once driven past, just to point and laugh. And Della and the boy Toby met, each of them, and showed them where to draw the water clean, and where to graze their gaunt animals, and the ridge that had been for 20 years a green wall of pure scorn. Over that one terrible summer, the beating thing that kept Hartselle County alive through to the rain. Osgood Pruitt wept openly at the spring, a grown old man weeping over a filling bucket, and still could not say the thing he had come to say. And Della, who understood people about as well as she understood her goats, told him only that a spring did not care in the least whose bucket it filled, and so she left him his dignity, which was in truth the very kindest thing folded inside the whole of her generosity. Wendell Trace made his last and worst mistake at the very height of it all. He simply could not understand, could not fit into his head, a person who would give away an entire fortune in water for nothing, and so he mistook her open-handed generosity for plain softness and weakness. And he went down to the county board and tried to have the old road across her land declared open and taken over as public, so that his interested parties might run their development traffic across her ancient bridge freely without ever once paying her a single cent for the privilege. But he had badly misjudged the ground he now stood upon in every sense of it. Heartfelt County was full that autumn of families whose thin children had been kept alive clean through the summer by that one cold spring and that bitter green brush. And when Wendell Trace stood up in the crowded board meeting room and argued smooth that Della Vane's land ought by rights to be crossed and used for the greater profit of certain gentlemen, from away the whole room turned upon him like weather rolling in off the plain. Osgood Pruitt rose up first, the very man who had laughed the longest, and said his piece plain and shaking, that he had driven past that girl to mock her, and she had turned around and given his children water when all his own fine laughing had not grown him one green blade of corn, and that any man who tried to take that girl's land would answer for it to him first. And the county surveyor stood and produced the state's own written records, which showed plainly that the bridge was hers to keep and steward, and the old road long lapsed for want of use, and that Trace's grand parties had no lawful claim upon any of it, save the one they'd hoped to simply frighten out of a girl standing alone. His whole scheme fell to pieces there in front of the assembled town, and Wendell Trace gathered his leather case and left Heartfelt County, and did not ever come back, and the ridge lots his parties had bought, so dear, stayed as worthless as thorn behind a bridge they could not set a wheel upon without the freely given leave of the very woman they had set out to cheat. The drought broke at last in September, as droughts finally do in a gray 3-day rain, that folks stood out in laughing, and the valley came back to itself slow over the seasons that followed, and Heartfelt County did not forget who had fed it and watered it through. When Della carried her sacks of dried rosehips down to the county seat, now, the men along the way tipped their hats to her wagon and meant it. When she needed a fence line raised or a roof patched before winter, there were more hands offered than she had work to give them. Osgood Pruitt sent his eldest boy up the ridge to help Toby through the next hard-kitting season, and would take not a cent of pay for the loan of him, and the two boys grew up half wild together on that hillside, naming goats and mending wire and swimming in the cold creek below the old stone bridge, which Della had cleared out clean and kept, and which became, in time, the one thing the whole county grew quietly proud of. The beautiful old 3-arched bridge up on the Vane place that folks would hitch up and drive out on a fine Sunday afternoon just to stand and look at. She built onto the cabin twice over the years. She kept some of the thorn always, a good working hedge for the goats and the fall gathering of the hips, and let the rest of it come back slow to open pasture and thriving orchard, and she paid the widow's grandson a fair and rising wage every single year of his working life, and when at last he was grown and ready, she sold him 20 of her 50 acres at a price so low it made the lawyer drawing the papers wince and object, because old Emil had once called 3 goats square, and had taught her by that what it was truly worth to a soul to do so. Emil Ostrander lived just long enough to see the second good year come around, and Della brought him up the path one last October in a cushioned cart, over all his stubborn protests, so that he could sit in the warm sun on the old stone bridge and look out over what his few plain words and his 3 parting does had made grow. He was very old and very frail by then, and he did not say much at all, but he laid his rough spotted hand flat upon the cool gray stone of the parapet, in the very same way she had laid hers the day the goats first broke through to it, and he looked out long over the 50 acres that the entire county had once sworn on their lives would give up nothing but thorn until doomsday. And he said the thing to her again, the very thing he had said over his fence years before, that the land had never once been poor. The land had only been waiting, all those long years, for someone patient enough to come and ask it the right thing. And then he asked her, with the faint ghost of that old private smile pulling at his mouth, whether she still believed, as the town had once been so sure, that a young woman all alone could never run a place the likes of this one. and Della Vane, who had bought 50 worthless acres of briar for $311 and turned them by patience into the very beating heart of a whole county, looked out over her fat goats and her heavy orchard and her beautiful bridge and the water still running cold and steady down out of the mountain. And she told the old man gently that she had never once, not for a single day, been alone up here. She had always had the land, and the land had told her everything she ever needed to know, the whole time freely, to anyone with patience enough to stop and listen for it. And that, in the end, is the truth of the whole of this tale, offered up here by lamplight to whoever cares to hear it told, that the world is forever full of things called worthless by people who never once troubled themselves to truly look, and that being proven right is a quiet and patient business best done without crowing, and that the surest road to riches any person will ever find is simply to give the ground, the very thing it already longs to grow. And then, when at last your own season of plenty rolls around, to fill up your neighbor's empty bucket before you ever stop to count your own.